Good morning and welcome to Jackson Today. I'm your host, Peggy Owens, and with me today is Jerry Watson. He is from Watson Funeral Chapel, and you have two chapels, as I understand, one on Spring Arbor Road, and where's the other one?
The other one's on Michigan Ave in Parma.
That one I've never been to.
Okay.
He's here to help my friends who don't have any end-of-life planning, and I think this is very important. I have several friends that really need your help. Jerry?
Okay, I'll do my best.
All right. The first thing I want to know is what happens when it comes to a funeral if somebody doesn't have any money?
Okay. In that event, the state does allow for payment for funeral arrangements and burial and cremation expenses. The folks do have to apply and they do have to qualify. Those are important things that they have to qualify. In the event that they do qualify, then family members are allowed to contribute a certain amount to those services, but they are limited to that contribution. In that event, the services that a family would select would be limited.
I know my ex-husband's grandfather had a funeral paid from the state, and when I worked for the state, I did emergency needs applications for funerals, but I don't remember how much they were allowed. I know it was a very sparse funeral.
It is. And the other thing that's happened over the last 20 years or so is as prices of everything, services, merchandise, tend to go up year after year, the amount that the state will pay toward a funeral has ironically gone down. So it makes it more challenging for sure. Usually in those events, what we do is take a family case by case, go through what their desires are, what their selections may be, and then try to work with them for the best resolve.
Well, that's good to know. So you're not just hanging out there. What if somebody has no family?
That can also be a difficult situation. What's available for folks to do now is you can appoint somebody your personal funeral representative. And of course, that's a legal document. Any attorney would have those documents for you to fill out to make that legal. You can also download those documents yourself and appoint someone. Of course, you'd need to have it notarized, etc. But then you could appoint someone in the event that you don't have any family members to be your funeral representative.
I know it's a touchy subject, but you really have to let your family or this person know what your wants are.
You do. And that's the most important thing, is to somehow, some way express what your desires are for your final disposition. Now, with that funeral representative, there is a little bit of a tricky case when it comes to cases of cremation, because Michigan law still states that the immediate next of kin has to authorize that by signature for cremation. So that does make that a little bit difficult if there are no family members.
Oh, I hadn't known that. Wow.
Yes.
I know it's difficult to speak to your parents, your brothers or sisters, or in my case, my boys are in their 40s. I had to say to my son, have you thought about this? I mean, children can pass away. What is it that you want? And how are you going to pay for it? Am I going to be stuck paying for this?
Yes. The discussion to have, as touchy as it is an important discussion to have, because all of us, frankly, are one day closer, no matter how old you are. So to have some type of conversation about what your final wishes are, to the extent that you go through with it ahead of time, now there's different variables there, but to have that discussion for your wishes is important. I guess I would advise to pick the right time, depending on personalities. I myself like to add a little humor. As much as the sadness is around us a lot, I like to add a little humor. Makes things a little bit easier. But maybe somehow I would advise folks to break the ice and just mention that. Or say, I'm thinking about getting this pre-planned and having my final wishes taken care of. And it also aids in the remembrance part when it comes to an obituary, community that you've touched, community that you've been a part of. Things like that are very important to remember the life that a person has lived.
With my son, I have no idea where he has his money or how he has his money. With my father, who we knew was getting closer, I mean, he was 95, closer to death, I was able to move some money from his account with his approval into a joint account so that I had it to pay for his funeral. What happens if you have all of your money and you don't have, maybe you have beneficiaries, you don't have any way for people to access this at the time of the funeral? What happens?
Well, the best way, if at all possible, for folks would be in those type of cases to pay for it in advance. Then you're locked in. So that would be the best way. The other way that would help make things less complicated is if that family member is on an account with their mother, father, brother, sister, whoever their family member would be, if they were on that account, so then they could access funds immediately without having to possibly have a probate situation, which then delays and makes things more difficult and also adds to expenses.
Yeah. So, like I said, I was lucky we thought ahead of this time, because other than this one account that I just happened to have my father's name on it, it was my account, just happened to have his name on it. And I thought, we better talk about moving some of your funds to pay for all of these expenses. And so with my brothers and sisters and his approval, that's what we did. Unfortunately, you have to have a trusted family member to be able to do that too.
That's true. And that's why the state has allowed for, unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't always work that way. Differences with families and their relationships. That's why it is legal to designate a funeral representative who would be able to handle the complete funeral arrangements. The only exception being that if the person's selection was cremation, then there would have to be an immediate next of kin to sign for that authorization.
And you hear all of these horror stories about parents that had trusted a family, put their name on their house, and then they sold their house underneath them. So you don't think that's ever going to happen to your family. And fortunately, luckily, I don't have a family like that. I went to my dad. I saw that all of his accounts had my niece's name as beneficiary. And I said, Dad, this is your money. You do with it as you please. If that's your intention, then we'll go with it. It's your money. It's not ours. And he didn't remember doing it. I think I know why he did it at the time, but he didn't remember. And so we were able to change it. He was able to change it before he passed. It's important to have beneficiaries on your bank accounts.
It is. It is very important. Or a joint account. Some people go the route of life insurance. And of course, then there would be a beneficiary designated to that. And that's their means for final expenses would be a life insurance policy.
What if the beneficiary doesn't want to pay for the funeral?
Well, the funeral home would most likely make that determination during the arrangement process of how their selections would be funded. And what most funeral homes do, or what we do, depending on the situation, is we take an assignment to that. We verify that there would be enough to cover that amount, and then we have an assignment signed so that the insurance company would pay us direct, and then any other portion of that would go directly then to the beneficiary.
Because I know my sister married, and wonderful, wonderful man, but he didn't change any of his life insurance policies over to her. And so when he passed, she didn't have the money to bury him. Fortunately, the person who was beneficiary on the life insurance was willing to use that for the funeral. But what if he hadn't?
Yes, and of course, we've run into that through the years too, and that's why we do designate an assignment for an insurance policy, and that way we make sure that we're covered on that to have those final expenses paid.
Tell me more about prepaid funeral agreements.
Yes.
What are they?
Well, prepaid funeral agreements are a great method for people to fund their expenses, their final expenses, in advance. There's a couple different ways to do that. There's trust, there's insurance. There's advantages and disadvantages to both, But in either case, what you end up with after you pre-fund your service is a guaranteed price agreement for most of the expenses. Expenses that you could pay for in advance that would be outside the funeral home, such as newspaper notices, flowers, honorariums for clergy to do the service, things of that nature, would not be guaranteed, but they would be prepaid and earning interest toward what the actual cost would be at the time. But any service or merchandise that was offered through the funeral home would be 100% guaranteed. And besides the peace of mind of having things taken care of, you also lock in at the price. So that is a benefit to prepaying.
If my 44-year-old son wanted a prepaid funeral agreement, and he came to Watson Funeral Chapel over on Spring Arbor Road, and would you look at the fact that, well, he's only 44 years old, he may live another 50 years, and figure the price that way?
Well, again, if he prepaid at today's prices, he would be locked in at today's prices. So we use insurance, which is a guaranteed performance rate, which is it's looking out for us down the road, because maybe what you're getting at is where would we be then when we're guaranteeing this price. So we want to make sure that we stay somewhat close to where inflation goes, along with the benefit of the family being locked in at today's prices. However, with someone at that age, or any age for that matter, I usually go over what are the benefits and what are the disadvantages to prepaying. Sometimes folks have life insurance, or they have their own funds or their own investments, and if that's the case, then it's not really necessary to prepay. So I would explain to them what the benefits are. The benefit would be you lock in at today's prices. The disadvantage to that would be is you're taking your funds right now for maybe a vacation or expenses or things that you would want to do, and you're paying that out now at a young age. So the individual would have to weigh that out. But in a case for where I would certainly recommend that people must prepay is if they're in a situation where they're in a nursing home and they're at the point where they need the full, complete nursing home care other than assisted living, the complete care, then there may come a point where they're not able to pay for that privately any longer at the cost of full-fledged nursing care. At that point, what a family has to do then is apply for Medicaid, so the state would come in and pay for those expenses for them. In that event, folks have to liquidate what they have, and they're only allowed $2,000 liquid that they can get their hands on at any time. Now, I fully recommend that they prepay for the funeral and make it irrevocable so that those funds that they paid for the funeral are not counted as an asset to them. It's not counted against their cash value.
I was going to bring that up because I dealt with that. And yeah, they didn't look at irrevocable prepaid funeral agreements as an asset.
Yes.
And so it is something
that's certainly the most crucial time, because sometimes folks don't realize that, and they've already paid so much, so they're out of funds even for funeral expenses. So I recommend that in any case, that if that could be a situation down the road, that's definitely the time that I recommend to prepay. Other than that, it would be a personal preference whether they want to fund these things in advance. But going back again to who should pre-plan, anybody should have their wishes known.
You're listening to Jackson Today. I'm the host, Peggy Owens, and with me is Jerry Watson from the Watson Funeral Chapel. Again, you have two, one on Spring Arbor, and where's the other one again?
On Michigan Ave in Parma.
In Parma. So he's enlightening me and all of you as to what end-of-life planning, I guess, is what I'd want to know. One of the things I was asking my son is, where do you think you want to be buried? I have a cemetery plot myself. It's near where my parents are going to be. It's near where my sister is going to, or my parents are, where my sister's going to be. I said, do you think I should buy you a cemetery plot? So when do you think we should purchase cemetery plots?
Well, here again, that would be a personal preference. Once you do buy that plot, it is yours. If for some reason you changed your mind down the road and didn't want to use that plot, it would be very difficult to sell, trade, anything like that. You could certainly give that to another family member if you weren't going to use that. I guess if I was the one that was going to be selecting a burial space, I would want to make sure that was going to be my final decision.
Well, since the rest of my family's here, and funeral spots get more and more expensive. Going back to the prepaid funeral agreements, are there tax consequences? I know there are in some.
Yeah, the only tax consequence would be if it was not put into a trust or insurance. If it was just a standard investment toward funeral arrangements. Anything that we write, we look out for that and to make sure that there are no tax ramifications. In the cases of an irrevocable agreement, then there's absolutely no tax ramifications because those funds are no longer counted as an asset to the individual who prepaid that because there's no ability to surrender it for cash like a standard life insurance policy.
I had a couple clients that had prepaid funeral agreements, and they were getting what the government calls K-1s.
Yes.
Sometimes the K-1s would come very, very late. So that caused problems with estimating what their taxes might be or having to file amendments. But you're saying that there are ones that you won't have to deal with that.
I don't write anything to where there would be any tax ramifications for an individual.
That's good to know. What happens if the funeral home that I go to closes and I have this irrevocable funeral agreement?
Prepaid funeral agreements, whether irrevocable or non-irrevocable, are transferable to any funeral home in the United States.
So if I came and had a prepaid funeral agreement with you and I moved to Florida and wanted to be buried in Florida, could it be moved there?
Absolutely.
Well, that's really good to know. I thought you were stuck with whoever you went to.
No, you're not. The only thing that you would have to look for would be, say, for example, we have a prepaid funeral agreement, and we use the same example you just gave. They moved to Florida. That money is 100% transferable, plus the interest that it's earned. The only thing is the other funeral home does not have to guarantee our prices. The price guarantee is between each funeral home and the individual.
If I'm understanding you, you're saying it may be better to, in many cases, to wait to do the prepaid funeral agreement later in life rather than my 44-year-old son.
If there was an individual that was 44 that came to talk to me about arrangements, I would definitely be very specific on the advantages and disadvantages of prepaying. I never recommend anyone to prepay because I think that's a personal choice, but what I can do is give them the reasons why they should and then disadvantages to maybe why they shouldn't, and then let them make the decision. Some folks that I've had, even at that age, they just simply want to get it done. And if that's their choice, then we're more than happy to handle that for them.
So what else should I do how should I approach my brother or sister? I have two single sisters, one that has a live-in roommate, the other one is strictly alone. I have no idea where her money is or what she wants. How do I approach someone like that?
Well, depending on their personality, for example, if it's my mom or dad, I'm going to say, hey, Mom, hey, Pops, maybe we should get the ball rolling on what you want. I would want to know what you'd want to do in the event of your passing. And with me and my family, I guess it wouldn't be that out there just because this is what I've done all my life. So it wouldn't be anything that they would look at as bizarre or where's this question coming from? But I guess the best way is just to break the ice and just say, what am I to do in the event that I lose you?
And it might be easier to start out with, this is what my plans are. One of the things again, going back to my tax business and my social service job, people don't always want to have their family or people knowing their finances. And fortunately, with my mother, she shared that information with me because my father had no interest knowing it. And fortunately, when my father moved back to Jackson, I knew everything that was going on. I knew what bills he had. I knew his business, so I was able to step in when he wasn't able to deal with those things. I've had clients where I had to say, your spouse is getting to the point where he doesn't or she doesn't know what's going on. Do you? And they would have no clue as to where their money was. Or my father was shocked to find out what my mother had left. He always thought he was going to die first. You can't plan on that.
No, you certainly can't.
So I think it's important for people to know, to find someone with confidence that they can deal with. There again, you've got all these horror stories out there. Do you run into those kind of things?
Over the years, absolutely. It's a touchy situation. I guess the best advice I could give is find someone you trust or handle it yourself. Because once an individual does make their arrangements and does prepay them, then they're locked in at that. At least there's a foundation of where their wishes are and the funds are there to pay for that. Even if something were to change between the time of that agreement and the time of death, as far as changing their mind, etc., at least there's a foundation and funds there to handle that.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I think it's important to know those things for your single children. Even when they're in their 20s, they could pass away in their 20s. Do you know where their money is and what they want? I have to laugh because my sister has told me where her burial plot is and basically what she wants. She doesn't want anybody else in her spot with her. Some cemeteries do allow you to have, especially if you're cremated, I don't know how to put it, two people in one spot.
Two or more, depending on the cemetery. Yes, yeah. That would be the technical term. Some people refer to those as ashes. The technical term is cremains or cremated remains.
Okay. If I had a full body in there, do some cemeteries allow you then to put cremated remains on top of me?
They do. Most cemeteries do.
And who has a right to decide that?
The lot owner and the next of kin. The immediate next of kin and the lot owner would have that decision.
Okay, so if my lot owner's sister said, I don't want anybody else in my spot, what if she passes away and I'm going to put my other sister there?
Well, whoever the lot owner would be would have that decision.
And when you die, you no longer become the lot owner.
That's correct. And the law in Michigan is stated that way. Some people don't care for that law, but the law is for the living. So once you pass away, you definitely lose your right to give your opinion or your answer on what the next steps are going to be.
Okay, people, don't tell my sister I said that she may have company when she dies. I don't think she would like that. I'm not saying that's going to happen either, but I think people should know that if that's their plans, if they don't want anybody, or the fact that there could be somebody else. If they decided that, because I have a friend there's a family plot, but there's only a couple spaces left and there's a lot more family members. They can double up.
They can. With cremated remains, they can do that.
In some of the cemeteries, yeah. I think that's an option people should know about. And then they wouldn't have to buy a whole another cemetery plots, which are, over $1,000.
Depending on the cemetery, they could be that or more, much more.
Yeah. That's a cost. What are some of the other costs that are involved in funerals?
Well, you would have your service cost, which would be whatever determination the family makes for the service. For example, what we call a traditional funeral would be a funeral that would include visitation and a service with the deceased present. with that in mind, then we would have embalming, other preparations. There's use of facilities, there's vehicles, and of course every funeral home would have an overhead fee, which would be their basic fee, which would help cover their operating costs, such as insurance, upkeep, staff, any other expenses, property taxes, whatever it takes for them to operate as a business.
And then also you've got, if you have church services, you've got fees for the singer, the organist, if that's what you're going to have, and then usually some sort of donation that you make to the church or the minister that's providing the service.
That's correct. Yeah, officiating clergy. Sometimes there's more than one. There would be maybe someone who a vocalist and an organist. You would have both of those. Other expenses would be flowers, death certificates, newspaper notices.
And then opening the grave?
Opening and closing of the grave. Now, the cemetery and the funeral homes in Michigan are separate. The law is Michigan has what they call an anti-combo act. So if you own a funeral home, you can't own a cemetery or a crematory. So the cemeteries are separate from the funeral home, even though sometimes when folks are prepaying, they include those expenses on the prepaid agreement, especially in cases of Medicaid. The only thing that the family has to know, and I always stress to them, is that those items on a prepaid funeral agreement are non-guaranteed items, simply because the funeral home has no control over if the cemetery wants to double their price tomorrow. We have no control over that.
Jerry, if I want more information from you about prepaid funeral agreements, about end-of-life planning, things like that, how would I contact you?
The best thing to do would be call the funeral home, and I would advise that to anybody. If they have any questions, call the funeral home of their choice and ask to sit down and have an appointment and talk about the things. At least that's a good start. Whether they prepay or not, that would be up to them, but they could at least get a start, get some prices, get some thoughts, get some literature, meet the personalities at the funeral home, see the facilities, how it might be located if people are coming out of town, and just get a general lay, kind of just like if you were shopping for something that you really wanted to shop for.
All right. If I want to contact you, what phone number would I call?
You would call 517-782-7144.
Okay. Give that to me again a little bit slower.
517-782-7144.
This has been Jackson Today. I'm the host, Peggy Owens, and with me is Jerry Watson from the Watson Funeral Chapel. May everybody have a blessed day, and discuss this with your family. It's important, people. Thank you. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you for having me.